Thank you. Thanks, Noel. Good evening, all, and a warm welcome to the National Liberal Club, one of the most inclusive clubs in London. I'm proud to welcome you to the first joint event between the Defence and Security Circle and the Commonwealth and European Forum, first in hopefully a long series of collaborations. Just some housekeeping. As Noel mentioned, it's being recorded, so on Zoom and in person, on Zoom, if you do have any issues, please turn your video off if you do not want to be recorded. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished speakers, Dr. Karen von Hippel and Dr. Alan Mendoza, and our distinguished chair, Lynn O'Donnell, who's joining us from Kabul for this event, The Think Tanks Still Matter. Dr. von Hippel is Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, having previously served for nearly 6 years in the US Department of State in various capacities. She has direct experience in over 24 conflict zones and has worked in the United Nations, for the United Nations and the European Union. Dr. Mendoza is a co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. He directs strategy for the organization, as well as acting as its main public face for various media outlets such as BBC, Sky, CNBC, and Al Jazeera, among others. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a trustee of the President Reagan Memorial Fund Trust. Our chair and interlocutor for this evening is Australian author and war correspondent, Lynn O'Donnell. Lynn was the Afghanistan Bureau Chief for AFP and the AP and is joining us from Kabul right now. Her highly praised book on a time in Iraq, Haiti and Mosul, was published in 2008. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you, Subir, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lynn O'Donnell, and I am in Kabul, where I'm reporting on the situation here, as I've done for more than a decade. I'm very happy to be joining you in London, albeit remotely, though I'd love to be on the terrace this evening for a glass of wine with everybody later. Welcome to Karen and to Alan, representing respectively RUSI and the Henry Jackson Society, to discuss our topic for the evening: do think tanks still matter? It's certainly an interesting topic for me from where I sit, because if I may make a general observation, that think tanks and commentators are guilty of a monumental fail when it comes to analysing the situation in Afghanistan, since former US President Donald Trump dined with the devil in the form of the Taliban and led us directly to where we are here today, with the government teetering on the precipice of collapse. And when I told a friend at lunch today that I was going to be moderating this discussion and told him the question to be addressed, he said no. So where do our esteemed guests, who are heavily invested in the think tank world, where do they sit? What do they have to say? I'm going to invite each one of them to speak to the topic, and then I'm going to ask a few questions, and then throw it open to the audience to ask some questions as well. Karen, let's start with you. Your think tank, RUSI, prides itself on its independence, though with the Queen as your patron, I guess you can't divorce yourself too distantly from the British establishment. Perhaps you can start our discussion this evening by telling us, what is a think tank and what is RUSI, and does it matter?
Thank you, Lynn. This morning, Lynn and I were doing a little bit of preparation, and I was a bit worried about her beaming in from Afghanistan. Little did I know the two London-based people would have trouble getting here on time. So there you go, Lynn. But thank you, Excellencies and NLC members. I have been a member of this august organization. I'm hoping to rejoin. And Noel and Subu and others, thank you for inviting me here today. RUSI is right around the corner, as most of you know, and this year RUSI turns 190 years old. It's the Royal United Services Institute. It was set up by the Duke of Wellington to find a platform off campus, if you can say that, away from the constrictions of the Ministry of Defense, where soldiers could talk about strategy after the Battle of Waterloo. That was really the Duke's original intention. Over the last 190 years, we've evolved a bit, and we now do defense, security, and international affairs. So we don't just focus on defense anymore. Probably about 30% of our work is defense. We are independent, as Lynn mentioned, but if you look at our website, you'll see many former government officials. But we consider ourselves a critical friend of the government, but a friend. We used to be subsidized by the Ministry of Defence, and that stopped in 1983. And since then, we've had to raise all of our own money. And so former colleagues like Mike Stevens, who's in the back, one of our Gulf experts, and others know how much work it is to raise almost everything that you do. And of course, you know, I help and others help, but our model is that we fully fundraise. Now, we've launched a philanthropic campaign to renovate our beautiful building that was built in 1895, and we're starting to do more in that space to hopefully take some pressure off our researchers who really raise the bulk of our money. Whenever we do get funded by whether it's individuals, corporate foundations, governments, we always make sure part of the agreement is that everything we do will be independent. We don't come in with a view. There is no RUSI view on any issue, whether it's Brexit or you know, what's happening in China. All of our researchers are experts in their own area, and everything is, we like to say, data-driven. Now, Lynn, you may say that think tanks don't matter, and I also worked at a think tank. Well, I'm not saying you don't say that, but you're saying that about Afghanistan. I spent about 5 years at a think tank in Washington, and you know, you can either say, you know, we got it all wrong, or even worse, we got it right, but no one listened to us. And so that also happens quite a bit. I think if you look back over probably many of our reports at RUSI on Afghanistan and where I used to work on Afghanistan, given we've been there for 20 years, many of our countries, there's certainly ample literature. One of the failings of think tanks is when they aren't able to disseminate their findings in a way that's digestible by government. And so that's why, for me, it's so important that many of us have had government experience, because you certainly can say, I want to end poverty and this is how I'm going to do it. But if you don't understand how bureaucracies work, it's really, you know, it's an incredibly complicated space to try to get things done, as all of you know who have worked in bureaucracies. So I think I will stop there with my introduction and look forward to further questions. Lynn, do you want me to pass it over to Alan?
Yeah, no, well, sorry, you'd think I'd know by now to unmute myself. My apologies. Alan, good evening. You founded the Henry Jackson Society in 2005. Can you explain what your motivation and vision was in doing that, and does it matter?
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you all for bearing with us as we braved various arduous journeys to get here. So firstly, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to sit here with Karen, who really has done the most remarkable job actually in her time at RUSI and has transformed that organisation. I would say certainly RUSI matters a lot more since you arrived than afterwards, so I will say that. But in a sense, the Henry Jackson Society is the opposite to RUSI. So they're old, we're young. We were formed, you know, sort of 15, 16 years ago. They're perhaps more establishment focused. We're perhaps more anti-establishment focused. Not that we're anti-establishment, but just that we don't, you know, have the Queen as a patron and all that sort of jazz on top. Equally, we work less with bureaucracies and more with politics, if that makes any sense, looking at how we can actually get action at the political level, and then it's up to others, maybe like RUSI, to work out the bureaucratic hurdles in that. So you've got two very different models, and of course we're, you know, a fraction of the size in terms of staff and turnover and the rest. The one thing we share in common is that everyone has to, if you like, you know, eat what you kill. There's nothing on the table. If you don't bring anything in, there is no staff, there is no food, there is no building, and all the rest of it. So on that basis, we're all united on that. But our motivation back in 2005 was to look at how British foreign policy was being discussed, British security policy was being discussed, particularly in the framework of the Iraq War. And we did come at it with some principles. So there are certain things the Henry Jackson Society does believe that, you know, for example, democracy is better than dictatorship. I'm sure, you know, people at RUSI believe the same thing, but it's the way that we obviously present that sort of argument that means that we are obviously much more easily codified in the sort of the think tank world. Despite that, we're not, in our view at least, we're not a left or right wing organization, and certainly our staff would, you know, kind of cross the boundaries. We would rather see the world, if you like, in a interventionist versus non-interventionist sort of circle. And when I say that, I mean it's about people who want to try and take charge of problems as opposed to those who would prefer perhaps to isolate from them, is that division. And then you can be on the left or the right of politics, or even have no politics at all as far as that matters, and still be part of our sort of big tent in that regard. So that's essentially how we came to it. We wanted to foster a different discussion debate. We think over the sort of 15, 16 years, we occupy a useful niche in the, if you like, the Westminster market in terms of representing views that are not simply here in this part of town, but also reflect, you know, different bits of the UK as well, and what is thought out there. I think if you look at think tanks, you can look at who their client audiences are as well, and who they might represent in terms of what they can bring to the table in that regard. And we would like to say we represent a certain sliver of thinking, which we, you know, hope is larger than smaller, but which we then try and translate into policy terms and into initiatives. But the game will do the same as RUSI in terms of research beyond, and then trying to get that research into the hands of government to try and encourage it to make a difference. It's all about education and trying to find the best paths. And clearly why, you know, both of us would think that think tanks matter in that regard is that think tanks are about ideas at the end of the day. And, you know, certainly what we do is bring ideas to the table so that policymakers can look at them. They may reject them, they may decide they're not the right ideas for them, but at the very least, they should look at the ideas and have to reject them, if that makes any sense. So it's about fostering the climate of intellectual debate, trying to create different policy solutions that can then be picked up by people in power to make them happen. And certainly, I would argue that that is a valuable and useful thing to have in your political game, because let's be honest, the politicians are not going to come up with the ideas, are they? So someone's got to do the thinking. Now, it may be us, it may be other people, but certainly within that whole ecosystem, think tanks, in my view, and I'm sure you share that view, have a very important place to help share those ideas.
Thanks, Alan. You mentioned specifically Westminster. We've been in a pandemic world for a year and a half. I'm interested to know from both of you what's been the impact of the pandemic on the work that you do and the events that you hold. I'm thinking in terms of internationalisation, broadening it out from your traditional audience. We've all gone online. We do Zoom. We can participate from wherever we are. I'm in Kabul, for instance. Expanded reach, the confluence between domestic and international. Karen, do you want to address that to start off with?
I would be delighted to address that. Thank you, Lynn. And also, can I say what a pleasure it is to be seated next to Alan? My first event I did at RUSI, I was introduced to Alan. It was probably the first few days I even arrived for this job. And we collaborate on occasion with Henry Jackson Society. Some of my colleagues speak at their events and vice versa. So we do all have you know, sometimes some of my trustees say, I've noticed this other think tank does something very similar to us. Should we be even in that space? And first of all, I think it's good to have a healthy competition. And second of all, as most of you probably would agree, there's enough work out there for all of us right now, given the state of the chaotic world we're in. But yeah, it's been very interesting how we've all adapted. I think we've been quite lucky. Our business models really are perfect for being trapped at home. We don't have students, so we don't have to worry about teaching and getting academics in and out. We can do most of our events online, as Lynn has said. We have done recently, we did an event recently. We've done a few hybrid events like this. We had a strategic command conference about a month ago, and Secretary of Defense Secretary of State was there, and I did the ribbon cutting welcome Secretary of State, and then he spoke, and there were about 80 people in the room, and after he stepped down, I started clapping, and everyone looked at me a little awkwardly, like, oh, right, I forgot, we're supposed to clap. So I think our muscle memory has gone a little bit, so we expect a rousing applause at the end of this today. But you know, it's interesting, Lynn, because we certainly have changed our model in many positive ways. Of course, the negative is you don't get the networking, you don't get the chatting behind the scenes that all of us really miss. But RUSI has gone from an average of 4,500 people coming in and out of our building per year to over 31,000 online. We've gone from mostly catering to the London-based with occasional visits in from the countryside to people joining us from 180 countries during the pandemic. And so we need to figure out how to capitalize on that. I think all of us, probably every single person in this room, is struggling with post-pandemic, what will our, hybrid working, home, back in the office, younger people mentoring, all those challenges I think we're all struggling with a little bit right now, and none of us really know, and it may be a couple more years that we're in this situation. I think the other interesting thing for me anyway, I participated in a really interesting event with a young Peruvian who runs this think tank consultancy business. And it's quite interesting. And he organized this really cool conference for think tanks from all over the world. And this woman and I were on a panel together, similar to Alan. She was the new think tank, and I was representing the old think tank. She happened to be younger than me too, but hey. It was just really interesting because she said, we mostly focus on domestic issues in Argentina, but now we've attracted people from all over the world. And by the way, so many of the issues that Alan and I and our colleagues look at have, there's a confluence much more today with domestic and international issues. So whether it's terrorism or climate change or Chinese investment in Europe, a lot of these issues now overlap. And so interestingly, some think tanks that have just focused on domestic issues now are looking at more international and vice versa. So I think overall, I would say, Lynn, it's been very positive. But I suppose the negative sides are that for all of us that have been around for a while, it's pretty easy to set up a think tank if you can just do it in your living room and you put up your little poster behind you. So we probably could face more competition. And so there's a lot more pressure on fundraising, on quality control, and just making sure that we focus on issues that matter and get some ideas out there. One quick comment on the ideas piece before I hand it over is I think it's not just about, for us, it's not just about getting ideas out there, but it's about testing them. And then often you'll find, if you work in government, you find you have very little time to think about longer term issues. And so think tanks can provide that service. And sometimes the government asks us to do some research for them because they don't have time. So we can do projects that that may only exist behind, security walls in government, and we can do it publicly. A related example is we have one project where we use a whole bunch of really creative open source tools to monitor North Korean shipping sanctions busting ships, basically, and then we publish the results. And so this is something that I think governments might have more difficulty doing, even if it's funding our work. Now, we have to be incredibly careful with a project like that, because you can imagine we could get sued by some very wealthy people that don't like what we're doing. But it's also an opportunity for a think tank to be contributing in a different way than this is what should happen. These are the lessons learned in Afghanistan. So there's lots of other creative things going on. Thank you, Lynn. Over to you or to Alan.
Well, thanks, Karen. We're talking really about the globalization of ideas. Alan, the generation of ideas and the dissemination of ideas was very central to your opening remarks. What do you think about the impact of the pandemic? As I said, globalization of ideas, competition, consolidation, where does it all go?
Well, yeah, so I think it obviously led everyone to look at their models and go, well, how can you make a difference in a very different world where you're not in the physical anymore, you're in the virtual? And yes, we're back in this physical sort of side, but actually I think we're back in the physical with the virtual and with the knowledge of the last sort of 14, 15 months as well, preying on our minds. The first thing to note, I think, is when COVID hit, I think a lot of us in the industry looked at it and went, what do we actually do now? Yes, okay, we can all work from home. That bit is the easy bit, but should we be still doing the same work as we were doing before? I mean, the world, if you remember back in March, April of last year, wasn't particularly interested in the old problems. It was interested in the new problems, and what was being thrown up as a result of the new problems. So for us, it was an opportunity straight away to go, look, we need to change up what we're doing, because if we continue down the old path, those issues will come back. But right now, you'll be talking to a void, because nobody will be interested in talking to you about those problems. So we made a bet basically and thought, for the next 6 to 12 months, people are going to want to talk about COVID-related issues, whether that is the great power system in the realm of COVID, the connections of China and COVID, and what this means in terms of supply lines, supply chains. Look at how the world has changed, in the last 20 years, globalization, where's it going? All those sorts of questions really came to the fore, and some of our more traditional work was pushed to the side. And so we decided to roll with the punches, basically, and go with that program. And it worked amazingly well, because not only were we now speaking to a British audience, but a world audience who were all for the first time interested and connected. And you started seeing hundreds of people turning up to your events, whereas before you might have had 50. Now we were getting an average of 500 people to an event, and we were doing things at various times that meant we could catch the Pacific audience and the Atlantic audience and anything between to try and make that. And you could, of course, get, crucially, panelists from all over the world as well to be speaking. So in a sense, your expert kind of quotient dramatically increased early on, and we were able to play into that. And I think that's been, obviously it's diminished over time because people got Zoom fatigue, because I think we all got a bit much after a while. But it showed us that there's an immense possibility of working across borders on similar issues, finding allies on the same subjects, finding people who wanted to contribute to discuss. And certainly I think, although we've all missed the physical conferences, and there's certainly a benefit to meeting in person, both for kind of the personal human touch element, but also the kind of let's exchange ideas in a more closed format style of conversation. But at the same time, you were able to find new ways of disseminating and discussing. So I think on benefit, oddly, the pandemic has led to a kind of a useful shift in how think tanks operate. Yes, there's going to be more competition, because you can, in fact, start one, at home and go that way. But at the same time, we recognize that it's only because of your networks and contacts you're able to bring in all these people. So if you start something new, you're not going to get the level of speaker you need to really draw a big audience. So I think those are still the barriers to entry until you've proven yourself, as we all had to do at various points to get to that level. So like I said, I think, it's been interesting considering it, looking at the changes. On the whole, despite this pandemic having been a pretty wretched time for the think tank industry, it's opened up new avenues. And I think we're not the only ones in terms of being able to share and bring more to the table as a result.
Indeed. Thanks for that, Alan. I'll just remind people who are joining us this evening to please get any questions that you might have for Karen and Alan ready, because we'll be coming to you. It'll be your turn soon. But Alan, you touched on the, I guess what we could call the quality of the people that you may have access to, because during the pandemic, we're maybe Zoom fatigue, but also Zoom access or Teams access, there are other brands. So you could possibly talk to people at a higher level of their expertise, if you like, in government, because they're sitting at their desk. They don't have to travel. They don't have to come to you, or vice versa. So as a balance to the democratization of and the globalization of what you're doing, the dissemination of ideas, has it also led to a quality over quantity, if you like? Are you accessing and able to bring in higher quality? I guess it's not quite the word that I want, but more high-powered speakers, more people who are more at the edge or at the apex of the ideas generation of what they do. What do you think, Karen? Have you had that experience?
Yes, and it's interesting. Alan mentioned Zoom fatigue. We have a whole range of private and public, et cetera, events, some of which we use for fundraising. And we hosted somebody the other day who I thought would be a huge draw. And I suspect a lot of people didn't come just because they're kind of fed up with watching people on a little computer screen, because we all know what it's like. You get a bit distracted. Not this audience, okay? We know you're all fully focused on what we're saying, but we get a bit distracted when we're at home. It's easy to go onto mute and finish your laundry. So you know, it's hard to say. I mean, we had a great event on peacekeeping when the special rep of the Secretary General joined us from Democratic Republic of Congo. That was fantastic. And as you say, Lynn, in the past, someone would have to be in town or fly over, and it's not so easy to get people like that. It's fantastic having you and Kabul chairing this event, and I'm going to invite you to come and join us for future events now that I know where you are and what you are doing. So, you know, it's really mixed. I still prefer 3D to 2D, and I think, you know, there's I think the problem really is because there's so many online events. You can hear everyone from Bill Gates to Bill Clinton to whoever on an online forum. You can just go to YouTube basically and search that. I think we need to be a bit more creative about what kinds of events that we do going forward. And there's still nothing like the in-person dinners and events, especially with important people, because I think not important in a, I mean, people who are doing important jobs so that you can really get their insights. I mean, you know, I was visiting an ambassador recently, and it was, you know, in person, I could say to him, oh, how did the meeting go between President Biden and your fearless leader? I can't do that on a Zoom call because no one's going to be honest with me about that on a Zoom call, because we all know that the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians listen in to every call that we make. So, you know, they're just, we still haven't figured it out yet. We're still thinking through what do we need to do to make some of these events more interesting. We have a great lineup of participants who join us for these events. So I'm still not entirely sure, Lynn, is my answer.
I hear what you say about doing your laundry while having something on in the background, but I think that was one of the great things of the pandemic, that I did have access to a much broader range of thought makers and opinion makers, and I could just potter around while listening. What do you think, Alan? Have you found that sort of an impact on the work of the Henry Jackson Society through the pandemic? Has it broadened, narrowed? What's your feeling about where you go forward?
Yeah, I think, again, you know, similarly, it broadened at the start because you, of course, had that, you know, novelty effect, and that actually enabled people, you brought more people in who always wanted to come to your events, but found it very difficult. Now, you could literally be at your desk at work and go, right, I'm taking a bit of time out, I'm going to watch this event, basically, rather than having to journey across town, half an hour to get there, half an hour. So suddenly what had been a 2 or 2.5 hour round trip became just a 1 hour experience. And that was tremendously useful for busy people. I think, you know, we're all very busy people in this room as well. And to actually come and do something, you have to make a significant investment for. But if you suddenly lower that, you can really get more people to come quite quickly and easily. And that works. And equally for a speaker, rather than having to wait for them to come to London, you could literally get them everywhere. I remember, you know, dealing with one quite, you know, famous individual who was holed up in a cabin in Wyoming. And we'd never have got him, but he said, you know what, I can just go on my computer and be with you. So from that perspective, it was, of course, tremendously broadening to be able to bring people in. Also from the private work side, in the sense of researchers speaking to people, private meetings, it was very easy to set up meetings in a way you'd have to normally negotiate diaries, particularly with people abroad, of course, where you'd have to physically go and see them. Now, everyone was much more attuned to the idea, well, we'll just go on video, you know, and get on that way. And there is something, although it is infinitely less satisfying than 3D, video is certainly better than audio when it comes to making sure people are paying attention. Audio calls, you've got no idea what's going on, you know, behind the scene. I once recall actually being on a conference call with a group of people. One person had forgotten to put on mute and was clearly making dinner, at which point the convener said, look, well, whoever's making dinner, please put your, you know, because it was just ridiculous. But you could get away with that in a way you can't do with video. Yes, you can look at other things, but it was a step change in that regard and enabled you to really do more. I think, though, Karen's right. We are now at the stage where everyone's doing these events, and now there is no novelty anymore. So it is nice to see people here tonight, for example, because you've come, you've made an effort, you want to, you know, talk and engage. And clearly, hybrid is the way forward. But we have to do some more interesting things than simply hybrid, because they'll have to, because everyone will do hybrid shortly as well. So we're all going to have to become innovators once again to work out what is the best way to use something. I would imagine some form of interactivity is going to have to be the way to make a difference. What that is, though, don't ask me yet, Lynn, but it'll come. Maybe even the course of tonight we'll have some ideas even. Let's see.
Yes, indeed, and something to look forward to. I think not only in person, but neither of you really addressed the consolidation issue. Do you think that I know you said that put a banner behind you, you've got a think tank online, but do you think that with this expanded reach and the broadening out of it, and perhaps the Zoom fatigue, whether we go hybrid or not, that we might see a consolidation and that there will be fewer players, if you like, in the think tank space? Like I said, a quality over quantity. What do you think, Karen?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, these are some of the questions we're struggling with in terms of if we became a fully virtual think tank, we could hire people from all over the world. So that would be a very different model than being a British-based think tank that focuses on British and international issues. I'm not sure. I think it's really hard to predict right now, because I think we're going to be in this weird middle period for a couple of years, and I think we'll try different things. But I was very worried when the pandemic first started about the world economic situation, and given how reliant we are on the world for funding, where we would be. But it turns out we've actually done quite well. I'm still knocking on wood, because but we don't know, in the next few years, if there is some sort of, economic downturn that would obviously affect many of us. And we found that some things are a lot easier to do. Like we do a lot of capacity building training, whether it's in countering violent extremism or helping border police understand illicit wildlife crime and how to follow the money. And many of those we've actually been able to do online. So instead of my colleague having to schlep, travel for 24 hours to get somewhere, some of that we can do online. So, some of the training works and some doesn't work. And I suppose just one more comment about, internally, actually, last year was our first online think tank. Now, our bylaws were written 190 years ago, didn't account for virtual events. And we've just recently revised them, but it was actually really fantastic bringing people in online, because so many of our members actually could join. Whereas in the past, we'd have 15 or 20 people in the room maximum. And, the meeting was over in about 10 minutes. Last year it went for an hour because we had so many people joining us. And that's great. You can engage members more. And we are a member-based organization. I don't think you are.
We are,
oh, you are
not
too.
on your scale. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure our scale is so enormous, but so some think tanks don't have members, and we do. It's another way also that, it's another way we have financial support, although they're one stakeholder, not the only stakeholder that we have. So, there's lots of things to be thinking about, and, we certainly don't have the answers to many of these questions.
Alan, do you have any answers to these questions? Let's talk about.
Well, so it's an interesting one, isn't it? Look, when you look at consolidation, there has yet, to my mind, been an international merger of think tanks. I'm not sure. Have you ever seen one? Think tanks. So you'll know if the market starts to consolidate when the first merger occurs, basically, and people go, we actually find some utility and some benefit from actually merging operations to think tanks, different countries. Between this room, we actually did have a look at that, not last year, before that even, looking to merge with another think tank, another country, but the hurdles were quite substantial. So it turns out that consolidation, as always, relies upon getting over those hurdles. It's not like the corporate world where you can simply buy one. It doesn't work like that when you're dealing with non-profits. There's nothing to buy. So from that perspective, it's a difficult process to merge in that way. So my feeling is that you'll probably see actually a proliferation of organizations that call themselves think tanks, but there will be distinctions, because unless you find your niche, unless you find what you're there for, you will literally only be a smoke and mirrors type thing where you exist, but what are you actually doing, and what can you show are your results? I think the key thing is you've got to be able to show results, whether it is to your stakeholders or to the media, to governments, whatever it is. And I think that will be the big separation. You will have perhaps a small number of people who can actually show the results, but a larger number of people who want to encourage you to believe they can, lead you to the results. So that's perhaps how the industry might move. But honestly, I would love to see consolidation. I do think there's a path for, if you like, alliances with think tanks. Maybe we're like airlines. Maybe we'll join the Star Alliance or the whatever the other ones are, the One World, and discover that we form a more looser confederation. There are things like that, like Atlas exists already. That is, if you like, an alliance of different think tanks. It might be that those things, because the world is much smaller now, is a way to see consolidation without actual formal mergers.
Lynn, can I just add a quick?
And it'll be.
Oh, can I just add a quick point to what Alan was saying? Because I agree with him on the proliferation. We often get people that get in touch with us. This think tank in Washington called the Center for New Strategic Thinking, and I've never heard of it before, wants to do some work, and you end up looking at all the people and then maybe you recognize them. So I agree, there's a proliferation and they all have very similar names to the ones that we have.
Yes, they do indeed. I wonder if we can just talk the dirty for a moment and ask about. Let me ask you about your funding models. I'm not sure a lot of people would understand how you exist, how you draw in money to ensure your existence. I know that RUSI, I can't access a lot of the research that you do that I would love to be able to, because I'm not a member or a subscriber. And I know that you also have funding from corporations, that sort of thing, and that Henry Jackson works in a different way. Can you, Karen, just explain in a way that you're able to without giving away too much?
We're very transparent.
Okay. Just in case, how do you stay afloat? Where does the money come from?
No, everything is online. We're a charity, and so you can go to the Charity Commission website and see pretty much everything we spend money on. We post everything. There's a NGO called Transparify that rank think tanks and how transparent they are. 5 is the best, and I guess there's a 0. But we have been 4, along with Brookings and Chatham House and others, because we put every donation above £500 or every grant above £500. Some of the ones that are 5 put £500 and below, whether from individuals or research funds. And then we also list on our website, over £10,000, over 20,000, and it's individuals, companies, governments. Every single funder is fully online. And we have to do it that way because we need to make sure that people don't accuse us of bias because of a particular funder. So we're very careful about it. And I, having worked at think tanks for much of my career, I've seen a lot of things happen to think tanks. In America, there was a journalist going around pretending like he represented a country like Turkmenistan or something like that. And he was trying to see how desperate think tanks were to take money, and he said, well, we're worried about our reputation, and so if we give you this money, will you host events? And that will, because people think, oh, it's a think tank, so it's not a lobbying organization, it's more of a neutral ground. And so there certainly are, and then in many parts of the world, think tanks are funded by governments, so they're not at all independent. And those governments assume, the Chinese, of course, are a good example. They assume that everything we do is a government policy, when of course it isn't. And that's why we often, all of us are, lots of hacking attempts on all of us, because many of these governments think that we're directly connected to the British government. So yeah, I mean, our funding is mixed. So we, sometimes we come up with the idea and we run around and try to find people who can fund it. Often we respond to tenders, whether it's British government, the EU, or the Ford Foundation, and we write proposals and we compete for tenders like many people do. And then other times people come to us and say, would you do a study on blah, blah, blah? And, that's the other way we do it. It's probably about 30% in each category for us.
I understand what you're saying about China. I was a journalist there for many years, and because journalists in China work for the government, there is an assumption that journalists everywhere work for their governments, and that's across the board quite clearly. What about you, Alan? You have a different sort of funding model, I'm assuming, to RUSI. Can you explain it?
Well, actually not. We've got the same basic model. I mean, essentially, all think tanks will take a combination of the following. The percentages might change, but it'll be a mixture of membership. Some may not have membership at all, and that tend to be obviously smaller amounts. Then you'll look at corporate sponsorship. You will look at grants of various kinds, whether those are foundational grants or government grants, where you do the tendering process that Karen was just saying. And then there's sort of donations as well on top of that. So there'll be sort of a mix in that. We're probably more donation heavy, but we're actually moving now more towards towards a grant model as well, because, you know, we've had some success in tendering in various places. So I think, you know, and again, the exact same principle when it comes to looking at how the projects end up emerging. I suppose the one difference is that, you know, because of our principles, which are clearly stated on our website, we won't take any money from what we might term dodgy regimes. It just is not going to fly. And I remember being approached several times by certain countries saying, would you like to, you know, have money from us in exchange for a program? And we're like, well, it's not going to do any good, because we'll use the money to condemn your country. That's what we will do, basically. So I suspect it'll be a stunningly bad investment on your part. And of course, they quickly, you know, ran away at that moment in time. So for us, it's kind of self-selecting in terms of who. You've got to be a democracy, basically, if you're going to work with governments or even companies to work in that sort of area, or even individuals. I mean, we all know there are places where you can be less certain and more certain of where your money might be. And you've got to have a know your client policy as well in that regard. So it's quite important to us to be able to, you know, have a be satisfied on that score. But again, I will say it is sometimes a dangerous game as well for funders. You've got obviously the official, you know, kind of hacking process. We've all had hack attacks from China, from Russia, from, you know, Iran. But sometimes, I'm sorry to say, you also get some other issues as well. So because we do a bit of work on, you know, radical Islam, members of our staff have had death threats, you know, threats that targeted by people on social media beyond, to the point we've had to have police over at various times. They've had to have in their homes sort of a police walkthrough. This is what happens if a madman turns up at your door. You escape that way. I mean, it's that's how real we're talking about. So there are real world consequences of some of the work we do, and that obviously, you know, entails funders also can get caught up in that as well. So it is can be sometimes a dangerous game as well, because although we'd like to think all we're doing is putting ideas out there, some people don't like the ideas we're putting out and are willing to try and take action against it.
Always the case, sadly. I'm going to throw over to Subu, because the privilege of being in person is that you get to ask the questions first. So Subu, would you like to choose from the esteemed audience there the next few questions for Karen and Alan?
And sorry, if I could just cut in there. I think Subu has the esteemed opportunity to ask Lord Palmer to come to give the first question from our running sheet.
Thank you. I was asked if I would make some comments and ask the first question, if I may, and I've been writing notes down and scribbling them down. And the thing that really got me is how things, and compliments to the National Liberal Club for organising this, because how things have changed. And I just couldn't help thinking, listening to our correspondent from Kabul, that some years ago, I rang up Paddy Ashdown, a Liberal Democrat politician, late Paddy Ashdown, and I rang him and got through on his mobile. And I said, I'm sorry, Paddy, I can't hear you. There's a lot of noise. He says, because I'm in a foxhole in Kosovo. And the thing is, nowadays, you know, we can have conversations from Kabul, which is not sort of someone down a foxhole talking into a mobile telephone.
It could be any minute.
Sorry?
It could be any minute.
It could be any minute. Oh, sorry. Yeah. You see, it's all these you see, it's about secrecy. It's under you're there, and I'm not. Didn't really see you. I think the interesting thing coming out of this meeting is the thing that I have every day in House of Lords. I did it today. Is that we work in a hybrid way. So we're doing partly for real and partly virtual, and I'm a deputy speaker, so you've got to look at the screens, look at the people there, and we're now talking about what's going to happen come September. Are we going to all be there physically? And it's, you know, people are getting kind of worried about going back to what it was. I don't think it will ever be what it was. My questions really are, well, and you mentioned hybrid. I mean, YouTube, no one mentioned YouTube. I mean, you have this, and then you can't forget it because it's going to come out virally on YouTube. And so life can be just not an instant, but carry on. My question really is are think tanks academic, or are they actually doing something for real? Are governments too short term? Are they all looking for the short term? And are think tanks trying to give them some longer term perspective? And lastly, do you think that one of the things that think tanks could and probably do is help with conflict resolution?
Well, let me give a quick crack at this. Okay, so thank you, Monroe. Wonderful to see you, and thank you for your recognition of the way we're working with the Lords in the same sort of style. I think that's a very good and appropriate analogy. When we look at your questions, essentially, looking at are think tanks academic or do they real things? I mean, gosh, I'm sure some academics would bristle at the idea they're not doing real things. But I think what you're getting at is essentially what is the point of what you're trying to do? Certainly, when it comes to, I think, the research we do, I'm sure the research RUSI does, it is peer reviewed to an academic standard. So you'll look at it and it will go through the usual process of maybe blind review, external, you'll get that kind of comment. So it's not, you'll be hoping that the work that comes out has undergone the same degree of rigor that academics would have done at a university in that whole process. And that's, set up in that way. I suppose the difference is that whereas at universities, you can produce material that is, very important stuff, but doesn't have any necessary immediate world impact. Here, in order to justify somewhat your existence, you have to have some relevance to what's going on in the world, because otherwise, what's the point of it? You may as well just give that work to the university instead to do. Here, essentially, we're trying to bring things into the policy world. Now, of course, some of that can be blue skies thinking. It can be stuff that politicians haven't yet focused on because they're too short term, to bring into your second point. So yes, you can look at the sort of the ideas and try to, and certainly we've had several examples of things that we were frankly, condemned for whistling in the wind at originally. Then people several years later went, no, actually, that was quite a good idea. We regret not. And it's interesting going back on that and looking at how those ideas can become part of government thinking, having been initially sort of poo-pooed. And finally, when it comes to sort of conflict resolution, that's not so much the work we do. I'll let Karen speak of that if there works, but certainly there are some think tanks that do that conflict resolution, track 2 diplomacy stuff in particular, where they sit people down and can come with kind of solutions that arise from it in a way that maybe governments can't, because governments can't quite talk to people in quite the same way that non-affiliated organizations can. But even in our limited way, we can again address conversations that would happen in a different way to either politicians or governments, because they don't want to have their fingerprints on them. So that's of course a useful sort of halfway house.
Yeah, thank you, Lord Palmer. It's a great question. And I know you, as you say, you're struggling in the Lords about next steps, and people having to wear trousers now in the Lords too, right? I mean, I understand that was an issue. One guy wore shorts, didn't he, at one of those meetings, I think. But I think, on the academic issue, it really depends what kind of academic you are. There's some academics that are purely theoretical. And then there are many academics that are very into applied academics, and many of them like working with us because they know we are right in the heart of Whitehall and we can reach out to government and invite people like you to our events. So they appreciate having that interaction, which you don't have as much when you're an academic, but it depends where you are. But I think your short-term, long-term question is a good one, because many of us who have been working at think tanks do spend a lot of time thinking about, before the pandemic, what if the whole system crashes, supply chains, all the stuff that we've learned about. And it's, when you look at those kinds of issues, it's very hard to get anyone to focus on them, right? Until something happens. And then when something happens, then people go and dig up all those studies, right? And so sometimes post facto, some of that stuff helps. But governments in our type of societies, the non-Chinese societies, have trouble thinking long term, because it's election cycles, it's 3, 5, 4 years till you're out. You want to get a lot done. So even when I worked, for the Obama administration, everybody was thinking, oh, well, we have these big strategies where, the pivot to China or whatever it is that. And then the day-to-day realities just drag you down into the Syrian civil war and to all sorts of Ukraine, and you don't have time to think about how you're going to pivot to China. And then all of a sudden it's almost too late, because the world's changed so much. And so, and while many think tanks would have been writing about this in Washington when I was in the government, you know, they weren't able to influence enough about what was going on. So, you know, it's very hard. This is something I do think about a lot. It's very hard to, from the outside or the inside, to get governments to think long-term. It isn't impossible, but it's very difficult to do. And you need to have a president or a national security advisor or something who is really focused, has the ear of the prime minister or the president, and is the one who every day will say, we're going to make this happen, because, you know, we all know it matters. Otherwise, you get distracted so easily by, well, you know, from being in government.
If you are in the room, please put your hand up and the microphone will come to you.
Thank you, Derek Macaulay, a member of the NLC. I think this is a really timely meeting on the role of think tanks. I don't know if you read The Guardian last Friday. There was an article by George Monbiot, basically with the title, "Our gullible BBC has let climate deniers walk all over it." And to paraphrase his argument, it was basically that the big business climate deniers funded think tanks and quote unquote research institutes rather than lobbying groups, because it gave them credibility with the BBC and the media, and really that power imbalance between what he would argue civil society and the ability to influence government and big business using think tanks. So how would you respond to what clearly is in The Guardian? So it's out there. It's out there on the progressive left as an argument that says think tanks are actually just lobbying groups.
I'll start because I think it's a great question, and this is why I think Alan and I would both say no to certain funders for that precise reason, because they do that. And that was the example I was using earlier when I was in the States with the Turkmenistan. They see think tanks as, you know, they think people will believe them more because of that. And we had the same issue that Alan was talking about with another government that said, we want to set up a center that studies my country, but you wouldn't be able to talk about our domestic politics if we gave you the money. And of course, we had to say no to that too. Likewise, if a climate denier came to us, I mean, we have had, all these committees now. They didn't exist before. We've set them up in the last 5 years to look at every single biggish potential donation before we even go there. If there's a whiff of something that doesn't smell good, even if it actually is pretty clean, we'll say no. Now we're in a better position to say no now because we're not struggling financially like maybe we had been about 6 years ago. But we do say no quite often, sometimes for those reasons, sometimes if it's a government that we think could look, you know, go into do some nasty things to their own people, that won't look good because, you know, our trustees worry about that too. And they worry about their reputation being affiliated with us too. So it's not just me or the researchers that I worry about. I have to worry about the reputation of the Institute. And, you know, sometimes you can't help it, right? Many museums took money from the Sackler family before the opioid crisis, right? And that kind of stuff is just a risk that everyone takes. We take money from some big philanthropist, and then you find out later, you know, all sorts of things that no one knew at the time. And then you have to decide, do we return the money or not? That's why, in a sense, what Ellen was talking about when we talked about our funding model, there are a few think tanks, the European, what is it, ECFR, European Center for Foreign Policy or whatever it is, which is,
European Council.
thank you. They have offices, you know, in about 6 or 7 countries, and they've moved from London to Berlin. But George Soros has been one of their big funders, and we don't have a big individual funder like that at RUSI. And sometimes my colleagues complain because they have to raise a lot of money and it's a lot of work, and it's, you know, and you're raising the money, then you have to do the work and make sure it's good, and you have to keep raising the money. You know, it's sort of, you feel like you're on this treadmill the whole time. And, you know, if we could find a individual donor, that some think tanks do have that. Koch brothers are a good example. They fund, you know, similar story like the Atlantic Council. Then takes the pressure off the researchers, but you have to be careful about who that potential, you know, who that person is. So it's every single day we worry about that question.
I don't have too much to add to that, because Karen's answered it excellently. I mean, essentially, yes, you've got to be careful about, who it is approaching you, and think about the broader reputational issues as well. I mean, if it were to come out that X and Y were funding you, what would that mean for the people who worked with you and beyond? And I don't know, I didn't read the article, so I don't know which think tanks he's referring to, but I guess they must have had different calculations for why they felt it was fine for them to do that. But I think, it is down to every individual organization, just like any business or any individual for that matter, to police what it does and consider how it might operate. And so certainly from our perspective, its reputation is very important. We are all charities. We have to be mindful of reputations. And as a result, I'd like to think we're quite self-selecting in the way that we will pick donations and not go for the obvious or even the slightly unobvious ones which might cause reputational damage down the line.
Simra Erin-Nija, a member of NLC. I have many questions, but I'm going to ask only one question. As your job is to make us think about certain things, so I would like to know what is the level of the women voice within the think tanks? And are there many women in the decision-making positions? And as well, if you have any statistics to enlighten us. Thank you.
Let me go quickly before the woman answers, but because here's your obvious point. One of the UK's leading think tanks, one of its biggest, the oldest, the most famous perhaps, is headed by a woman. So that should, I think, give you confidence in general. But from our perspective, we're 50% in our senior management team female, and we're a majority female staff. So that should hopefully answer that question there.
So I'm the first female director of RUSI in 190 years. So, internally, we've been working very hard on diversity, not just gender, all aspects of diversity. I'm sure Ellen is. All of us, like many of you here, probably after the George Floyd incident, a lot of us, our staff really care about these issues, and we've been making a lot of changes. But we've been working on it really since I joined, because obviously I'm a big fan of diversity as well. And internally, we're now at parity for women and men, and we're equal in numbers. I think there may be a few more women, and it's across RUSI at all levels. And the salaries, we make sure every year our salaries are commensurate. The women's salary, the men's salary at the right levels are equal. But I think we struggle more with our membership. So I think only 30% of our members are women, and that's something we need to work on. And a lot of traditional RUSI activity is defense focused, and you find fewer women, but you find fewer women interested. So in the old days, you'd come to a RUSI event and it would be mostly older white men in the room. We're trying to fix that. We're trying to, appeal to younger generations, etc. But it's a constant struggle, and it's a lot of work. And now a lot of donors, before you get grants, they'll ask you, tell us about your diversity and how you're doing on that, because they won't fund. And sometimes governments and others, some speakers won't speak if the panel is what they call a manel, if it's only men on the panel, and you have, but it's sometimes what'll happen is there'll be the token woman as the chair, and then it'll be only male speakers, right? So, there's lots of things to think about in this space.
Indeed.
First of all, I want to...
Could we throw to the online audience, if at all possible, just suggesting?
Yes, I think that's a good idea, Noel. Christopher Samuel wanted to ask a question. Chris, are you there? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much indeed. I'm a member of a small think tank which has been running for 10 years, which is called Defence Synergia, and it majors on UK defence activity, but it's inevitably go to strategy and all that sort of thing. What worries me is that in the UK, the defence organisation is very little known about by either the media or the politicians, and especially on the operational side. I'm a member of RUSI and I value it tremendously, but I think that the operational side of veterans and people who have operational experience and of consequences is just not represented. In fact, I would almost compare it to the defence industry in the UK, where we are the SMEs and the big boys never get the primes, never let us come in and be involved. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm glad to hear you're a member of RUSI too. certainly it's a challenge, and I hear that from other, you know, former officers quite frequently, or former soldiers. It's something that we worry about, that we want to make sure we represent our core constituency. Military sciences is central to what RUSI does and has done since we started. And so we're, you know, whereas often the money is easier to raise for the sexier issues. So whether it's illicit wildlife trafficking or climate insecurity, and sometimes it's harder to raise money to look at defense issues. So, you know, it sometimes is a struggle, but I think we try to keep it balanced. But happy to hear more from you. If you want to send me an email, I'm happy to chat about it more, because I have heard from other members similar comments before.
The defense expert's spoken, so I'm not going to add much to this one.
Or anything. Is that right?
There's nothing to add on there. The authority, when the authority speaks, you don't need to double comment.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen and Alan. David Nordell, you had a question for our panelists. Can you unmute yourself and ask away?
Yes. Okay. Can you see me now?
Yes, I can see you and hear you.
Super.
Please ask your question.
Okay. I'm actually a former member of RUSI many years ago, but I don't live in the UK, so there's not a great deal of value in being a member now. I'm a member of Chatham House, though. Apart from the example Karen gave about the project on North Korean shipping, which I found fascinating because I've also been involved in the whole issue of counter-terror financing and so on and so forth. Can you both give examples of notable successes and failures in your think tank work since the pandemic started, and perhaps also in other think tanks of which you're aware? Because I think it's important to see if there have been any changes in what's happening to think tanks generally as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'll have a little crack at that. I mean, oh, I can hear the rain has started again. God, that means my house is going to fall down. Successes. Well, during the pandemic, I think, you know, part of the work we've done is particularly on the China issue. We made quite a central focus on reassessing the strategic relationship with China, understanding what is happening with China's ambitions, with China's neighborhood relations, with China's wider relations, China's economic plans, so on and so forth. And certainly I'd like to say that we played a pivotal role in the coalition to transform governmental views on issues like Huawei and beyond that. So when you're looking at, you know, major successes in the pandemic, I think getting a hard and sharp assessment, a reassessment, a focus on what we as a country should be doing, what others should be stitching together as part of the international sort of, you know, kind of consensus on China, we'd like to think we moved that forward tremendously. There are other examples. I mean, you know, it wasn't necessarily pandemic related, but we did a lot of work on terrorism legislation during this period, which was successfully changed. We have seen, you know, kind of universities or rather government changing views on visas for students, issues like that in terms of, again, relating to Chinese military universities. There have been bits and pieces, you know, when you target. When it comes to failures as such, I'm not sure, you know, there was a great campaign we ran that was a failure in that way. I mean, there's always just ongoing work, though, things that you haven't quite got to fruition. I mean, I'd like us to go further, obviously, on the China issue than where we are. It's interesting looking at the politics of it and working out where the government, the opposition, certain members of the government, certain members of the backbenchers, how they view the issue differently, how you're balancing economic considerations, trade considerations, human rights considerations, strategic considerations. Now, our belief would be you want to shift it more into a certain direction. Others will resist that. Have we therefore succeeded? Have we failed? Well, there's progress, but you know, as we have been saying, there's a long-term thinking game. And I don't want to, you know, pass judgment on others. I think think tanks will have had their own successes and failures. And for one thing, I won't know enough about what they might have been doing to actually make an assessment on that. But I'll speak to that as to what we feel were successes, where there's still work to be done. But the ideal thing is to think we're there for the long term on thinking these issues. And, you know, we first started raising issues about China over 10 years ago, and people were going, well, laughable. They were saying, don't be ridiculous. Here's a peaceful rise. It'll be fine. You know, they're going to get prosperous and it won't be an issue strategically. sometimes it takes 10 years for something to be apparent. We'll still be there in 10 years' time, hopefully making arguments now that people will think is ridiculous, but hopefully in 10 years' time we'll go, actually, yes, we are ready to move now. So that's sort of the success failure line.
I'll just be brief because I know we have a lot of questions. I think the only thing I'd add is that I think sometimes people think we can do more than we can do, and we play a certain role, but we're not there to solve problems necessarily, and we're not there to tell governments what to do. We're convening power. We try to generate new ideas. We try to bring the right people in the room to talk about them, but we're not going to solve a lot of problems either. We're one part of a larger puzzle that works on these issues.
And if I could just add to that,
Thanks,
nor are we
Karen.
Lynn, can I just finish on that?
Go ahead.
Actually, nor are we supposed to. Here's a key thing. I mean, at the end of the day, people elect politicians to make the actual decisions on these matters. Now, we're not elected. We can provide whatever advice, but it's up to other people who are elected to make those decisions. I think none of us would aspire to, kind of subsume that either.
My audio's dropped out. There we go, I'm back. Thank you. Sorry, I had a bit of a glitch there. The next question we're going to hear is from Steve Price. Are you there, Steve? I can see you. You've got a little hand on your screen. Can you unmute yourself, please, and ask your question?
Hi, my name's Steve Price. I'm a former mine warfare officer, Royal Naval Reserve, and nowadays I help veterans with post-traumatic stress. The question comes to me because I've been a very interested listener to the RUSI podcast on the Western Way of War. And there's been some very esteemed speakers on there. But the question that comes to me is one of double accountability, not least because I often have to ask and answer the question, was it worth it? And was it worth it is a very pertinent question to veterans who may have been through experiences that few other people share. And as we look at, for example, our departure from Afghanistan, I'd like to suggest that think tanks are then held to a further responsibility of addressing the question of creative tension insofar as we might want to be helping Afghanistan find solutions beyond military intervention. In other words, a creative tension that may have to be upheld from a distance by the West. And so the question is, what accountability does RUSI, for example, feel in relation to future questions that might arise in former theatres?
I guess it's a great question, and I totally understand what you're saying. And so many of us who work on these issues would agree. For most foreign interventions that the US, UK, and others have undertaken over the last few decades, I mean, Afghanistan in particular, and I think I was talking to Lynn about that this morning. It's pretty rare that you'll find a RUSI publication that will say, go and invade this country. It's more likely that we will have a discussion about the pros and the cons and issues to consider, including some of the points that you're raising, Steve, about the real human cost that we've seen for some of these conflicts. And it's sometimes it just totally breaks your heart. And some of these conflicts are, this is a longer discussion about the ethics of all of this. But I worked for General John Allen, who's a Marine, when he was the American Special Envoy to counter the Islamic State. And for me, that was a much easier one to do because it seemed so much more black and white than many of these other conflicts. When sometimes you just have a kid who has no money and has to just, go and join some of these groups. Of course, many volunteers for the so-called Islamic State also were confused and may not have known what they were getting into, but many of them really did know what they were getting into. And to me, you know, I had a little bit less sympathy, but it's a huge struggle. And yes, accountability. Look, if we did, there is another think tank in London that was very gung-ho about the Iraq War. And all of us should do our own internal reckoning if we end up in a situation like that. And we should be publishing something online about why we made those choices and how we feel about it. I absolutely agree with you. I don't think governments are accountable for the work that they do overseas. Even humanitarian organizations are often responsible for bad things happening, and they're very rarely accountable in the countries where they work. So I think you raise a very good point.
And I would just add to that, I think, yes, you find in the past that there are people who have advocated certain views. They may have got those views wrong with the benefit of hindsight in terms of how history is kind of about. But I would put it in a slightly different way. If you came to those views honestly through a process of rigorous academic, discovery, you presented them because you truly believed them, having done the work, you weren't, sort of being pressured or taking a point of view just for the sake of it, and you were proven wrong, well, then that just shows you're a human being. Ultimately, people do make mistakes at times. It's certainly possible to argue something, thinking it was right, trying to factor some of the conclusion, then not turning it up. I do remember actually, one of the architects of the Iraq War saying to me long after it, he said, when we were deciding whether we were going to invade Iraq or not, we weren't stupid about it. We weren't saying, look, this is the solution. We had a whole, kind of smorgasbord of things we had to consider. If we do this, it might lead to that, it might lead to that. If we don't do it, it might lead to this, it might lead to that. And we knew we'd have to kind of own what the end result would be. Now, maybe we got it wrong ultimately, but we went through a process, it didn't work out, perhaps, but who was to know or to say what the other process? And here's, of course, the other thing. You make decisions, you advocate, if they happen, you go and you look at that and you can easily see it. But if they don't happen, nobody ever does the accountability the other way to go, well, oh, a disaster's occurred, you argued the other way. I'm not expecting anyone to suddenly knight you or anything like that, but there is also that whole principle that actually it is very difficult to argue the counterfaction and work out what happened there. So you should be accountable, of course, but at the same time, if you get things wrong, it shouldn't necessarily imply that everything you go in the future is also wrong as well. So you just have to come to it with the spirit of intellectual honesty, I think, and then look at it from there.
Indeed, thanks, Alan. There's a lot of coulda, shoulda, woulda in hindsight, and that's very much happening with Afghanistan now. I would like to throw back to the room in case there's any more questions from the floor. Noel, is there any hands raised where you are?
Yes, Lynn, there is somebody with the microphone, but before he asks this question, could I ask the panel to answer this with the other question? If the Wavell room is making noise for defence from practitioners, is there space in the policing or intelligence sphere for a similar bottom-up talking space on ideas? But if we could, there's the gentleman at the back with the microphone. Over to you.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here and to listen to your experience directly from first hand. I'm an NLC member and also King's College London student, so I have had the opportunity to attend dozen of RUSI events. I'm sorry if my voice is shaky. I haven't been surrounded by so many people in over 2 years. I assume the majority of the questions you receive would be directed to what is deemed as the enemy to contemporary democracy, so Russia, China, etc. I want to direct my question towards specifically UK and US, and I want to direct it specifically to something you mentioned earlier about the role of think tanks in the contemporary Western world. You mentioned that there are a lot of politicians that after they retire or they're not able to be re-elected, they will end up in a think tank. And since I have studied quite a lot in terms of American political system, I wanted to ask, how do you explain or how do you reason the difference in the British and the US system in terms of, if we look at directly Biden's or Trump's cabinet, we had people who were not in power beforehand, but they were in something what the Americans call the revolving door. So they might have went to intelligence service, and then they might have went 4 or 5 years to academic service, and then they went back as advisors. In the UK, I know of the Australian Prime Minister from 2010 to 2013, Julia Gillard. She went back to King's College London. There is Baroness Sally Morgan, who was part of the Liberal Party. She went back and forth to King's and I assume Cambridge, but I might be mistaken. And as well, the biggest historian of the Falkland Wars, Sir Lawrence Freedman. And I just wanted to ask, how do you explain this difference? How do you explain more Americans going to the academic world and more British politicians going in think tanks and NGOs? And thank you. And again, sorry for my shaky voice.
Sorry, I might cut in. That may have to be the last in-room question. We're getting very close to being thrown out, as they say. But over to you.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think it's a great question, and actually was on one of my notes to mention the US versus the UK. And we do work on many issues. Alan's think tank probably focuses on themes more. We look at the UK's relationship with Europe post-Brexit. I mean, we do a whole bunch of different things that are not only about Russia and China. And we do invite police and intelligence officers, and we hire many of them as well. So it kind of goes to your question about practitioners versus non-practitioners. And I've always felt that, yes, the American system, they go back and forth all the time. I worked at CSIS and I went into the Obama administration with everybody. The place was decimated. We all went into the Obama administration. Then they all left when Trump got elected, and they were waiting around for Hillary to get elected. Of course, she didn't. And then they hung out for 4 or 5 years and then went back in. And many of them want to go back in who aren't, who are still in think tanks. Now, there's pros and cons of it, and we don't have time to go through all of it. But I think the pros really are that you understand, as I mentioned earlier, how hard it is to get something done in government, right? So you can't just march in the room and say, let's invade Afghanistan, or I've got a great idea about this. There's so many pressure points, and the American system is 10 times more complicated than the British one because it's so big. I used to go into the meetings on Syria because I was working on the Syrian opposition, and there would be 100 people in the room, from intelligence to desk officers to soldiers to police to this to that, and then every single one of them said, if I'm not here, people might die, I need to be in the room. So you have so many competing voices. I think at RUSI, though, we have more people actually that have practical experience. I mean, Mike Stevens over there, he was detailed to work in the Foreign Office for a while. He's lived in many of these countries. I obviously have worked in government. Malcolm Chalmers, our deputy, he was the special advisor to several foreign ministers. And many other people are now getting seconded to government. And I actually think it's a great thing, because I think it's very good to bring experience from both places back and forth. I think the only negative might be that if you're worried you want to get a job in government, you don't want to be too critical because you're worried you may not get a job. But thank you for that question. It was very good.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that, firstly, on the question of, kind of space and places, look, what's interesting now is that people are finding ways of communicating, even if they are in active service in various ways. And I think you can manage to do that online in a way you never used to be able to do. So I would imagine, yes, you will find similar waybill equivalents turning up, basically, because there's now the capability of doing that. You've got the tech to do it, and you don't have to necessarily be, kind of afraid of outing yourself in quite the same way that you once did. And just on the other question, just to add, yes, I suppose one big difference is, don't forget how government is composed. In America, you have the executive branch, where obviously you don't have to be elected as a politician in order to do it. Here, if you want to be in government, you have to be a politician. Okay, that's the difference. And so there is no I'm not a politician, I'm in government. You have to be in government, or rather in Parliament, to do that. Now you can be brought into the House of Lords or whatever, and you've obviously referenced Lords in that regard. But once you leave the House of Commons, say, unless you get re-elected, you're not going to come back in as an MP in that way. So it becomes a different game. Whereas in the US, as Karen has illustrated, you literally wait it out if you want between administrations. You don't have to enter Congress, stay well clear of that kind of nest of vipers, and you can go into the executive branch again. So it's a different system, and it works in a slightly different way to obviously how we do it here.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're just about out of time, and so we won't be taking any more questions, but a very stimulating discussion and a lot of things in there that could lead to similarly interesting panel discussions, perhaps for another time. But suffice to say this evening, thank you so much, Karen von Hippel from RUSI and Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society, and I will hand over to Nicola Williams for the more formal vote of thanks.
Well, I hope everyone can hear me, and certainly those at home can see me. First of all, I'd like to say it's not often as a lawyer and someone on the bench and a writer that I learn a new word, but I learned one today, manel. I'd never known about that, but that's a good one. I think coming soon in a Nicola Williams written book soon. My Lord, ladies, gentlemen, and colleagues, both here and online, the duty and the honor falls to me to give the vote of thanks to our speakers for this very informative and I think wonderful event. As I understand it, and I'm sure that Noel will correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first joint event between the NLC's Defence and Securities Committee and the Commonwealth Forum. So I thank both Noel and Subu respectively, who have really batted 1,000 tonight. With regards to each of our brilliant participants, starting off with Lynn. Lynn was as excellent a moderator and interviewer as she was a few months ago when we last met. I don't think you'd want to be on the terrace having a drink today though, Lynn. That's very, very fanciful thinking. Karen may not remember me, but I've actually met you before when I worked in defense. I met you in a crowded room, and I feel you when you say that we got it right, but no one would listen to us. Because when I was the service complaints ombudsman for the armed forces, I would write a lot of, I think, very good reports with some very good recommendations, and people would say how wonderful they were, but then wouldn't actually do anything with them, but not with all of them. So I certainly feel you on that. I'm very heartened to hear it in answer to the question about gender representation, both in your think tank and yours, Alan, that is improving, and certainly you're making measures to do that. I have to say, when I was there, I didn't see that either on gender or on race. But that was some time ago. Things have changed, particularly over the last 12 months. And I wish you all the best with that. Alan, we've never met before, but we're both fellows of the RSA, so I'm sure our paths will cross again. And I think you typify the independence of think tanks by plainly stating, to the example that you gave about a suspect country offering you money. Yes, well, we'll take your money, but we're going to criticize your regime. And I think that absolutely distinguishes a think tank from a lobby group. That in and of itself really does do that. So in answer to the question, do think tanks still matter? I think, and I hope all would agree, that for the discussion and global dissemination of ideas, especially as we enter a hybrid age, which I think will be the way of things going forward, I think the answer to that is most assuredly yes. And Karen had said that, she said, we expect a round of applause at the end of this. So let's not disappoint her.